faig quan acabi, Marta, perquè t'estic trucant. Bona tarda. Bona tarda. No va?
No luck? No. Do you want to try with mine?
Just push. Hi, yes? Bona tarda. No sé si se sent gaire, sí. Benvinguts a la quarta edició del cicle Aula Mediterrània 2017-2018 que organitza... No funciona. Hola? Ara tampoc?
No. I mean, I can scream.
Funciona, no? Doncs, no sé. Sí, ara? Deia que benvinguts a la quarta edició del cicle Aula Mediterrània 2017-2018 que organitza l'Institut Europeu de la Mediterrània, en aquesta ocasió en col·laboració amb el Màster de Periodisme i Relacions Internacionals de la Facultat Blanquerna de Comunicació i Relacions Internacionals de la Universitat Ramon Llull. Because of its long history and because of its magnificent culture and probably because of its strategically placed, a lecture about Iran, I think it's always interesting. But the recent protests, which have something new regarding the ones on the last years, the results of the last presidential elections, the hard controversies with the US administrations over its nuclear deal, and last but not least, the greater tensions with its neighbors regarding the war in Syria, especially with Israel, have driven the Islamic Republic at the center of the board again, and probably more in the center than ever. That's exactly what we have asked Dina Esfandiary to talk about. Dina Esfandiary is a Center for Science and Security Studies Fellow in the War Studies Department at King's College in London, an adjunct fellow of the Middle East program at the Center for Science and Security Studies. She has focused her research and past work on disarmament and non-proliferation in the Middle East and security and relations between states at the Persian Gulf. She is a regular contributor to the Washington Post, International Affairs, Atlantic Telegraph, Survival, which is the International Institute for Strategic Studies journal, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. Let's see if mine works. Yep?
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much for having me. So I've been asked to talk to you about Iran in the region, what it's doing, what it means, what it's going to be doing in the future. So I think what I'll do is I'll cover a couple driving principles of Iranian foreign policy, and then I'll talk to you about a few arenas that Iran is involved in the region at the moment. And I'm more than happy to answer questions afterwards on this, on other domestic issues, on elections, because I won't cover that in my talk, but if you do want to talk about it, then feel free to ask me questions about it. I'll be more than happy to cover them. So in terms of Iran's standing in the region, I think there's a general recognition that Iran is obviously a significant national state. It's large, it's resource rich, it has a youthful, educated, large population, again, and it of course sits in a very strategic location. It's a bridge between the East and West. Its position in the Middle East allows Iran to turn east, to turn to Asia for its trade relations, and it's much more advantageous in its position to do that compared to some of its Arab neighbors. It sits on the Straits of Hormuz, and this allows Iran to project power in the Gulf and to control the waterways through which a lot of the world's oil travels, which of course is hugely important. Iran is basically the largest country in the Middle East with the capacity to pursue a serious international agenda. The Islamic Republic itself is a reactionary power. A lot of people say that Iran is incredibly strategic in its thinking and in its foreign policy. I would actually argue that's not the case. Other than, the driving principle of we want to be a hegemon in the region, there's not much that Iran does that's strategic in the region. Rather, when it sees an opportunity, it jumps at it, and usually it's pretty good in terms of making the situation work out in its favor. What it doesn't have, however, is modern, conventional military capabilities. It actually has very limited ones, which restricts its ability to project its power in the region. And that's why, in order to overcome this disability, Iran relies largely on proxies in the region to project power. It's also trying to build a ballistic missile arsenal, as I'm sure you're aware, also because this allows it to project power and to deter others from attacking it. Iran's foreign policy is a product of its structural position and also a product of its government. So what does that mean? That means that basically the way that the government is structured also impacts how it conducts foreign policy, particularly in the region. Iran's politics are very fluid, believe it or not. There is a number of checks and balances within the system that ensures that no single power in Iran becomes overly powerful, and when the balance tips one way, then the balance eventually tends to redress itself in the other direction. Traditionally, foreign policy decisions are not the mandate of the president, like most other countries. In Iran, generally, it's shared between the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards. The supreme leader is the father of the nation. He has influence over all three branches of government and over the military, but it's influence. It is not complete control, like it's often portrayed to be. He's the final decision maker. He's not the only decision maker in Iran. He's the guarantor of survival of the Islamic Republic, and he plays the role of balancer within the system. So he is absolutely instrumental in ensuring that the system doesn't tip in one direction, overly in one direction or another. The IRGC, who are the ones who, the Revolutionary Guards basically, who are the ones who control foreign policy and particularly important files within foreign policy, is a paramilitary organization that was created following the 1979 revolution. The reason for that was because the Islamic State was basically too suspicious of the existing Atish, so the army, and so they set up this institution to basically guarantee the survival of the Islamic Republic. And gradually, as the years went by, it gained greater and greater power within Iran. Today, it is, the single most powerful entity after the supreme leader in Iran, with, its tentacles reaching into the economy, into social life, into businesses, into the military, and obviously into whatever Iran does in the region. The IRGC, in terms of foreign policy, tends to have greater control in foreign policy files that are of greater importance to Iran. And the only time that the president holds a foreign policy file and is able to basically have the mandate to drive it forward is when the supreme leader gives the president to go ahead and do that. So the nuclear issue was a good example of Rouhani getting a mandate to go ahead and to negotiate this agreement and bring it home. And part of the reason actually why you got a nuclear deal in the end was because this current president, President Rouhani, had a very good relationship with the supreme leader, which allowed them both to constrain what the IRGC was doing, or the influence that the IRGC wanted to have on this particular issue. And this domestic dynamic, which is constantly fluctuating, constantly moving, really explains why Iran's foreign policy is quite schizophrenic in nature. It really explains why in some arenas you have a very amenable Iran willing to work, for example, with the West in pursuit of its interests and also Western interests. So, for example, fighting ISIS in Iraq. And why in other arenas you have Iran doing things that actually don't even make sense for itself, such as keeping Assad in power at the basically risk of its fight against ISIS in Syria. So that you see that Iran's foreign policy sometimes just doesn't make sense. Iran has a number of drivers of its foreign policy, which it has had since the beginning of the revolution. And in this, I don't think that it's very different to other countries. I mean, we often portray Iran as being a singular state that's, abnormal and erratic. But actually, I think that much like other countries, it is driven by a number of principles that all countries and all states are driven by. For the Islamic Republic, one that was particularly important right after the revolution was the idea of identity. And its identity became linked to its religion. And this was one of the driving principles of Iranian foreign policy right after the revolution, which is why you had Ayatollah Khomeini, so the predecessor to Khamenei today, the first supreme leader, come out and make statements like, we want to export our revolution. We want to be the leaders of all Muslims in the region. It was a very identity-driven foreign policy. But that actually changed very quickly. And the thing that made it change was Iran's involvement in the Iran-Iraq war. When Iran was fighting its neighbor, it realized that just relying on its religious identity was never going to be enough to get the average Iranian to rise up and fight on its behalf, which is why you ended up having nationalism being slowly woven into this driving principle of identity. Now, it was a very different nationalism to the nationalism that drove Iranian foreign policy under the Shah, but nevertheless, the Iranian identity became important. It was not just Iran's religious identity, but the fact that we were Iranian, and so that became important. Prestige is a driving principle of its foreign policy. In the mind of Iranian officials and the average Iranian, Iran is a prestigious country. It's large. It should be a leader in the Middle East. It's a very educated population. And so Iranian officials say, why shouldn't we be part of the big leagues? Why shouldn't we be a regional hegemon? And that's really important. That was particularly important, actually, during the nuclear negotiations. So one of the reasons why the nuclear negotiations at first weren't going well was because Iranian officials were walking away and saying, we don't want to talk to the P5+1 in the West because they talk down on us. Who are they to talk to us like this? And it was only when appropriate levels of respect were shown to Iranian officials that suddenly the negotiations were able to actually go somewhere. As I mentioned, domestic politics is a major driver of Iran's foreign policy. And then, believe it or not, like any other country in the world, the safety of its borders and its defense is a major issue for Iran. This is absolutely no different to any other country. I'll give you an example. Iran's fight against ISIS became a major issue when ISIS started getting too close to the Iranian border. Suddenly, ISIS became a foreign policy priority for Iran, something that it wasn't as long as it was involved in Syria and, the other side of Iraq. So obviously, defending its border is important to it. Finally, for Iran, economics is a major foreign policy driver. And this became particularly important right after the Iran-Iraq war and after that under sanctions. When Iran was sanctioned and it was no longer in a position to be able to, develop its economy the way it wanted to develop it, forget the fact that it was messing up its own economy because of mismanagement, let's put that aside. The existence of sanctions became a major driver of a lot of decisions that Iran made in foreign policy. The most important of which was when it turned to Russia and China, basically, in order for them to become major partners. And what happened was, while the fact that it was under sanctions drove Iran's decision to turn to Russia and China, its relationship with Russia and China then became something much, much bigger on a political level, military level, economic level. And it just grew into something that was much greater than just the economic principle that had driven Iran to turn to those two countries. So, has there really been any change in Iranian foreign policy after the nuclear deal, which is what everybody hoped for? The deal did do one thing. It freed up political space for dialogue with Iran. Because while the nuclear issue existed, everything else took a backseat. Nobody could have any kind of dialogue with Iran unless the nuclear issue was dealt with first. It became the barrier to any kind of talk with Iran. The expectation for, most of the international community and the P5+1 was that a nuclear deal would be able to temper Iran's both regional activities and international activities. But it's I would say this impact has actually been mixed. While some areas of Iranian foreign policy have been tempered, in other areas, Iran has gotten considerably worse. The Rouhani administration, for example, made it clear that one of its aims was, after the nuclear deal, we're going to mend the divide with our Gulf Arab neighbors and mend the divide between itself and Europe. But Iran didn't do the things it needed to do in order for that to become possible. It didn't scale back a lot of its disruptive activities in the region. It didn't scale back its missile testing, for example. Now, nobody said that that was a condition of the nuclear deal. Of course not. But of course it would have been easier for Iran to engage both its neighbors and Europe and potentially at some point the US had it done those things. For the Gulf Arabs, it was no secret that they opposed both the nuclear negotiations and then later the actual deal itself, although they came out and supported it once it was signed. The issue for the Gulf Arabs wasn't actually Iran's nuclear program. For them, it was completely secondary. In fact, for them, discussing Iran's nuclear program just distracted everyone from the real problem, which is the problem of what Iran was doing in the region. And so this nuclear issue just became a cloud over any kind of dialogue that the Gulf Arabs could have either with Iran or with the West about Iran. Their concern was actually twofold. First, it was Iran's expansionist regional policy. And for them, the nuclear deal, the only thing it was going to do was give Iran the means to continue and potentially expand what it was doing in the region. And in fact, today, you see this very much in the Gulf Arab psyche, where they come out and say, Iran has won. The deal allowed Iran to win. Look at what Iran is doing in the region now. And their second concern, so this concern coincides with other concerns that they've had. One, which is the US pivot, and this growing feeling of abandonment by the US, even though nobody abandoned anyone, and they're still around, and in fact, even more around than they were under Obama. And then the other context was the fear of rapprochement between Iran and the US, which of course didn't materialize. So basically for them, the deal made an existing problem considerably worse. And with the deal, the need to counter Iran, to stand up to Iran, to deter Iran, to even constrain Iran, became further entrenched. This basically meant that sectarian conflicts in the region were inflamed and will continue to be inflamed for the foreseeable future, and that the region is just likely to double down on countering Iran. What does this mean? It means that any conflict in the region is going to be viewed with the context of we have to stand up to Iran, which is exactly what happened, for example, in Yemen. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the different arenas that Iran is involved with. Caveat is that I'm not going to cover all of them. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them afterwards. The first is Iraq. Iraq is an absolute foreign policy priority for Iran. It's a vital security concern. Iran shares, upwards of 900 miles of porous border with Iraq. It has economic interests. It has ethnic and religious ties with different parts of Iraqi society. And Iran's objectives in Iraq is threefold. First, to balance the preservation of Iraq's unity and its territorial integrity. Secondly, to ensure that it continues to increase its influence within Iraq. And third, to prevent Iraq from ever becoming strong enough to pose a real threat to Iran, because the last time that happened, it suffered 8 years of war. So how is Iran doing that at the moment? Basically, it's got commanders in place in Iraq to lead the militias under the Hashd al-Shabi umbrella, fighting, it's basically the state-sponsored paramilitary committees. It's got an overt public diplomacy campaign that it's put in place, which is relatively new. I mean, this has only been going on over the last few years, where you've got photographs of IRGC Commander Soleimani basically popping up on social media. This was something that Iran just did not do before. There's obviously military assistance, weaponry, advisory assistance, money, and most importantly, in the fight against ISIS, Iran was actually coordinating efforts between the different factions that were fighting on the ground, which was absolutely needed because the Western alliance did not really have much of an on-the-ground presence, certainly not in terms of coordinating efforts. It also was helping the central government and its armed forces fill the vacuum in the power vacuum in the country. Now, this can be seen both as a positive thing, but also a very negative thing. Iran wants either manageable instability, which would give it the opportunity to increase its influence in the region, or alternatively, a very easily influenced government in Iraq. For Iran, its involvement in Iraq in terms of what the public in Iran think is actually really popular. Particularly because of the rise of ISIS, again because of the memory of the Iran-Iraq war, Iran's involvement in Iran is not something that the Iranian population questions. And this became even more significant after, I think it was last summer's ISIS attacks in Tehran. I mean, there was not a single Iranian that came out and questioned what the IRGC was doing in Iraq in the way that it does, and I'll talk about this later, in Syria or in Lebanon, for example. So that's Iraq on the one side. So clearly, number one foreign policy priority, and Iran is willing to take a hit in other arenas in order to maintain its influence and the importance of Iraq as a foreign policy file. Then you have Syria. Syria is a symbol of and a means for Iran's influence in the region. It allows Iran to extend its reach all the way to the Mediterranean, and it allows Iran to continue to arm its vital proxies in the region, and particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iranian efforts include funneling money, surveillance equipment, military equipment, funding and training and arming local popular committee militias, similar to Iraq actually, and obviously very overt political support for one of its pretty much only state allies in the region and even outside the region actually. The Syria war, though, has been incredibly costly for Iran. Iran has, it's reportedly given Syria $12.6 billion in financial support, and this comes out to about, until a couple of years ago, these statistics aren't the latest, so I think I got them about a year or two ago, so they might be a little bit out of date. But until then, it was costing Iran up to $600 to $700 million a month. So it was a massive drain on Iranian resources, particularly at a time where Iran was facing, the height of sanctions. And this is part of the reason why the Syria file caused a lot of debate within the Iranian elite. It wasn't public, and it was only once protests broke out, I think it was about 2.5 years ago, and then again in December, when people started chanting during the protests, not Syria, not Palestine, bring the money back home. So really showing that even the average Iranian was very much aware that the scarce Iranian resources were being sent in the region rather than being spent in Iran. Now again, this debate actually went in phases. So it broke out, I think it was a couple of years ago when the Assad regime wasn't doing so well. It was right before Russia came to help Iran. And what basically tempered the debate was when ISIS became an issue. That quietened the debate. And then Russia came, and started helping the Iran side. And suddenly, Assad was gaining ground again. And so the debate was kind of shoved to the side and quietened for a little while. Recently, it's reemerged as both Iranian people and also the parts of the Iranian elite are asking questions about whether it's really worth Iran's involvement in Syria, whether Iran is actually getting something for it in the way that it did before. Also, the number of IRGC deaths had risen quite significantly, and this became very public, and so the return of the martyrs in Iran again made it a very public issue in a way that it wasn't at the beginning of the war. Iran's aims in Syria are to ensure the survival of some parts of the Assad regime. Iran's made peace with the idea that Assad himself may not be in place. And in fact, I think one of the points of Zarif's 4-point plan for Syria is that we accept that Assad will leave, but he will only leave after nationwide elections. And what happens is you have to have the Alawite system, the state system, stay in place, at least to begin with, because the idea is that they don't want to deal with anarchy in Syria, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense given that it's already a little bit of a mess in Syria at the moment. Iran wants to ensure and secure its access to the Mediterranean. Syria allows it to do that. Again, a lot of commentators say this is what makes Iran's involvement in the Syria war inevitable, and this is what means that Iran will not abandon what it's doing in Syria. It will persevere in Syria. I actually have a different perspective on that. Iran operates quite well in unstable environments, and in environments where you don't have, a national strong state. Look at Iraq. So the aftermath of Assad is not going to be very stable, and it's sure as hell not going to be a strong power that is, just listening to what the West wants. So I don't think that Iran is worried about its ability to have influence and its ability to continue its route of getting its resources to Hezbollah, for example, in the immediate post-Assad phase at least. And finally, Syria allows Iran to ensure that it has a seat at the great powers table, which keep in mind that when prestige is driving your foreign policy, that's a major issue. Again, the downside of that is that today Iran is not really in the same situation that it was before Russia joined the Syria war. Before Russia came on board, Iran was the big power involved in the Syrian conflict. There was no resolution of the Syrian conflict without any dialogue with Iran. Today, Russia's kind of ahead. Iran kind of looks like the little power next to Russia. And it almost seems as though Russia has greater influence with Assad than Iran might do. So I'm not, fully on board with people who say, no, but Iran has guaranteed itself a seat at the table through Syria. I think today a lot of Iranian officials are asking questions about that. So that's for Syria. Now we'll move on to Yemen. Yemen is a really interesting one because for Tehran, its involvement in the Yemen conflict is nowhere near as clear-cut as its involvement in Iraq and Syria. Basically, the Gulf Arabs under Saudi Arabia pointed to Iranian involvement with and ties with the Houthis as justification for their involvement in the war. The idea was, Iran is in Saudi Arabia's backyard, so we need to stand up to Iran in Yemen. But Iran's involvement with the Houthis is not, again, it's not as clear-cut. Yemen itself is very poor in resources. It has very little strategic value to Iran. It's definitely not a foreign policy priority. The Shia population in Yemen, sure, it's a useful ally, but keep in mind that the Houthis are actually from a different school of thought, which actually technically makes them closer to Sunni Muslims than to Shia Muslims. So they're not even that close to Iran. The Iranian link with the Houthis, to begin with, was exaggerated quite significantly. The Houthis actually have legitimate local grievances. They have been fighting the civil war for a while now. And Iranian direct control over them has been pretty limited. In fact, US intelligence came out and said that that Tehran actually told the Houthis, don't storm into Sana'a. I think it was in 2014, I can't remember the date. But the Iranian government actually told them, don't do it. What started the war, just don't do it. It's not going to work out well for you. We can't help you. And what happened? The Houthis completely ignored them. So this shows that the link between them was actually quite strenuous. The White House even said Iran has no command and control over the Houthis. Iran's focus with the Houthis has actually been on building capacity. So relations between them have been long-standing, but Iran basically focused on helping it develop its internal administration, its security management, providing the Houthis with religious education, for example, bringing them to Tehran, to Qom, for their religious education, and on building trade ties. The Iranian leadership firmly believes that it is not entrenched in Yemen, but rather that when it needs to, it can easily disengage from that conflict because its ties with the Houthis are not like its ties with Hezbollah, for example. And Iran is significantly more committed to Iraq and Syria than it is to Yemen. And so what you have is you have this questioning going on within the elite again, because they cannot afford to be involved in long, drawn-out wars on multiple fronts. And Yemen is the most expendable issue for Tehran. The only thing is, once everybody said Iranian control is there, this was a key opportunity for Iran. They were like, well, okay, if we're perceived to be controlling this additional capital, I think it was an Iranian parliamentarian, again in 2014 again, in fact, right after the Houthi takeover of Sana'a, who came out and said Iran controls 4 Arab capitals. Absolutely untrue. But once he said it, everybody believed it, everybody reported it, and it became the truth. So Iran was like, well, if we're perceived to control 4 Arab capitals, if we're perceived to be such a thorn in Saudi Arabia's backside in Yemen, then let's do it. And so Iran just massively ramped up its involvement from then on. But again, it feels like it can disengage from that conflict relatively easily. It just doesn't want to right now because it's a very low-cost way for it to be a pain in Saudi's backside. And keep in mind that Yemen is a major priority for Saudi Arabia, of course. It's their backyard, it's their zone of influence, there's a risk of spillover, there's a refugee crisis on its borders. And so for them, they have to stop Iran, they have to stop the Houthis, because otherwise, I think one quote that I was once told by a Saudi official was that Houthis are going to become the next Hezbollah, and it's going to happen in our backyard. So, I mean, for them, it's a major fear to stop Iran in Yemen. The result of this mismatch in priorities, in my opinion, is that you have this potential dialogue and topic area for dialogue, which is Yemen. Yemen could be where Iran offers an olive branch to the Gulf Arabs to talk to it. And reportedly, Iran has done it. The problem is that the Gulf Arabs perceive Yemen and some of the other conflicts in the region as Iranian involvement in Arab affairs. And as a result, for them, Iran has to extricate itself from these arenas before they can sit down and have dialogue with it. So it's unclear, particularly today, I think it's unclear, because I think there's less of a desire to talk to one another today. It's unclear whether Iran is actually willing to offer Yemen up as an olive branch, because it's just too easy and too low cost for Iran to be a pain to the Gulf Arabs in this area. And so as the conflict progressed, as I said, the Gulf perception of Iranian involvement in Yemen basically became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and Iran became involved, and it became the truth that Iran was really backing the Houthis in Yemen. So this leads me nicely to the next arena, which is, as a group, Iran's relations with the Gulf Arabs. As I mentioned, the Gulf Arabs view Tehran as a disruptive power because of its involvement in the region and because of its links to Shia minority communities throughout the region. While some of this perception is certainly warranted, much of it is also blown out of proportion, just like I said, in Yemen. Iran's view of the GCC actually is changing. Iran originally considered the GCC as an arena that it is not worthy for Tehran to get involved in, which is odd given that, the GCC is Iran's neighbors. But for Iran, its focus has always been, and this I guess is where prestige feeds into it, its focus has been, we're going to talk to the US, we're going to talk to the West, China, Russia, and I guess because the GCC is our neighbors, we have to ensure that we have more or less decent relationships with them, which obviously hasn't panned out so well. January 2016 was a major turning point for the way that Iran perceived its Gulf Arab allies. And the reason for that is after the hanging of Sheikh Nimr and the Iranian storming of the Saudi embassy, it became a very public issue for Iran. I mean, the Gulf Arabs were never something that the average Iranian, the Iranian public, was very aware about. But after this, they became aware of it. And after this and the subsequent hardening of Gulf Arab perspectives on Iran, a lot of Iranians were like, why are we trying so hard to have dialogue with Gulf Arabs when they are, so rhetorically aggressive towards us. As a result, any kind of dialogue with the Gulf Arabs, or pushing for any kind of dialogue with the Gulf Arabs, became a very politically costly thing to do. Zarif was called into parliament a number of times for questioning because he kept saying, I would like to build dialogue with the Gulf Arabs. So it became something that, the Iranian elite under Rouhani lost a lot of its motivation, which it had originally had right after Rouhani was elected. They were like, what's the point? This is costing us too much. So for a while, basically Iran had kind of given up on the idea of building dialogue with its Gulf Arab neighbors. And interestingly, within the GCC, you started seeing a growth of divisions amongst themselves, which Iran was also paying attention to. So, and the reason for, there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, relations within the GCC hasn't always been very rosy. They've always had their differences, but they've been very good at keeping their differences behind closed doors and dealing with them pretty rapidly. Today, obviously, this is no longer the case. The UAE, for example, started to become increasingly aware of its political power, both in the US, in Europe, and even its military power in the region. Its contribution to the efforts in Yemen were quite significant. And suddenly, they were able to use a lot of the equipment that they had bought, and they were able to use it effectively, and they are a strong power. In addition to that, a lot of their interests in Yemen, or at least that's how they perceive it, are not being necessarily respected. And they are coming up against, Saudi interests in Yemen, which are focused on fighting the Houthis, whereas the UAE is focused on stopping the spread of Islamism in southern Yemen in particular. And so you have these minor tensions growing within the GCC. And today, you can see the result of that. You have a significant split between different countries within the GCC, although the UAE and Saudi Arabia, interestingly, have put all their differences behind closed doors. The Qatar issue, and this again is important in terms of where Iran sees the crisis and where it's going. So the Qatar issue, Qatar has always been an issue within the GCC. That's nothing new. Its foreign policy after the Arab Spring, its support for Islamist movements in the region posed a real problem for its GCC allies. And in Yemen, it was loath to get stuck in another military conflict because Qatar sees itself as the mediator in the region. For example, it can't just disengage from Iran the way, for example, the UAE can, because Qatar shares a massive gas field with Iran, and it needs to have working relations with Iran in order to operate it. So when the Qatar crisis broke out, Iran was watching this very carefully. And suddenly, it had another opportunity right in front of it. And it was an opportunity for Iran to fulfill a lot of its regional goals with the Gulf Arabs. It allowed it to establish deeper ties with other GCC capitals, Qatar in particular, obviously. And it could continue to pull itself out of international and regional isolation by portraying itself as the liberator for Qatar and the defender of the weak, which it did immediately after the crisis and the blockade happened. And it also helping Qatar allowed Iran to continue its new PR campaign of portraying itself as a decent country with very limited goals, unlike the image that it has held up until now. It also allows Iran to highlight that its foreign policy is absolutely not sectarian, which is something that the Iranian government has tried to do. And so the growing relationship with Qatar is not the result of ideological convergence, but rather just an opportunity that Iran has seen and has jumped at. And so just like Iran's other relations with other countries, it's going to continue this as long as it serves its interests. So clearly, while the GCC is unified in its desire to contain Iran, all countries in the GCC want to contain Iran, significant differences have emerged over the most effective way to do this. The result, as I said, is that Iran is increasingly aware of these differences, and it wants to play on them. because it's figured out that's the best way it can meet its objectives. So what is it going to do? It's going to continue to be a nuisance to Saudi Arabia because it realizes that reaching out to Saudi Arabia is just not going to work today. And it's going to try to build ties with individual countries who are considered friendlier, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, because at the end of the day, the GCC is still the source of some economic benefits for Iran. And Iran wants to avoid too many confrontational fronts. It's already involved in a lot of wars and conflicts in the region. It doesn't want to have new ones. So basically, for the foreseeable future, I think Iran's stated policy will be, we're going to keep trying to dialogue with the Gulf Arabs, even though they don't want to. But I think its real policy is going to be to pick apart the Gulf Arab states and to establish relations with individual countries who are more open to establishing relations with them. So I think we'll stop there, because I'm out of breath. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dina. It's time for our audience. I don't know if someone can break back President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu to the table and open the arena of the debate. I think there's word here.
What about women?
In Iran? So I think that the issue of women's rights and the position of women in Iran is going to become a very public and visible issue, as we've seen with, for example, the recent protests against the hijab. I don't think that it is something that you're going to see major change in Iran.